August 1944, a remote POW camp on a Pacific island. The air is thick with heat and humidity, and the scent of salt from the nearby shore mixes with smoke from a distant kitchen fire. Barbed wire fences slice through the jungle, enclosing rows of wooden barracks. Japanese prisoners sit on the hard wooden floors, eyes hollow, bodies stiff from months of tropical labor and relentless monotony. A sudden clatter at the gate interrupts the quiet. U.S. soldiers approach, carrying bundles of letters, newspapers, and small parcels. The prisoners lift their heads, uncertain, wary, their expressions frozen between hope and disbelief. Some whisper to one another, gestures nervous and cautious, while others inch forward, drawn by the sight of unfamiliar foreign papers. A lone Japanese officer stands at the back, eyes widening. He cannot believe what he sees. The Americans are smiling, speaking softly, offering these items freely, without demand or reprisal. For the prisoners, the concept of receiving news from home without scrutiny or punishment feels impossible. It is a small, human miracle amid the harshness of war. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had reached a brutal and complex phase. The Allied forces had gradually seized key islands across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines, forcing Japanese units into isolated pockets. Many soldiers, cut off from supply lines and command, found themselves captured by U.S. forces. Japanese military doctrine, rooted in the Bushido Code, treated surrender as dishonor. Soldiers who became prisoners of war were often seen by their own officers as failures, while Allied captors faced the challenge of managing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of these prisoners in makeshift camps scattered across the islands. The U.S. military, guided by the Geneva Convention, sought to provide humane treatment. American officers understood that humane handling of prisoners could improve compliance, reduce resistance, and serve as a moral counterpoint to Japanese brutality in occupied territories. Camps were established with practical infrastructure: wooden barracks, mess halls, latrines, and shaded common areas. Prisoners received regular meals, medical care, and, in some cases, limited recreational activity. Guards were trained to enforce discipline while minimizing unnecessary cruelty, a stark contrast to the rigid and often harsh methods the prisoners had expected. In these camps, daily life followed a strict rhythm. Prisoners rose at dawn, performed assigned labor, clearing vegetation, maintaining facilities, or assisting in logistics, and were provided rest periods during the heat of the day. Letters and news were rare. Communication with the outside world was largely severed. Rumors and speculation filled the gaps, leaving many prisoners in a state of anxious uncertainty about the war's progress, the fate of their families, and their own futures. The psychological environment was tense. Japanese POWs had been conditioned to expect harsh punishment, public humiliation, or denial of basic needs. Many initially resisted cooperation, mistrust etched into every gesture. Officers among the prisoners enforced strict hierarchies, demanding obedience from subordinates and maintaining rigid decorum. Yet, the Americans' approach challenged this cultural expectation. Small acts of kindness, offering medical care promptly, allowing prisoners to maintain personal hygiene, or providing minimal personal items, began to destabilize the rigid worldview many Japanese soldiers had carried with them into captivity. As the Allies pushed further into Japanese-held territories, the flow of information became a subtle but powerful tool. Newspapers from the United States, letters from home, and occasional photographs served multiple purposes. They reassured prisoners that the outside world still existed beyond the camp fences, provided news of family and friends, and subtly demonstrated American technological and cultural sophistication. For the prisoners, these items were astonishing. Many had never imagined that captors would offer them such access freely, without inspection for subversive content, and certainly without reprisal for mere curiosity. By August 1944, several camps had begun controlled distributions of letters and newspapers. These were not mere morale exercises. They were carefully structured efforts to maintain order, improve cooperation, and foster a modicum of trust. American officers monitored reactions closely, noting the mixture of hesitation, curiosity, and disbelief that rippled through the barracks. For many prisoners, the first glimpse of a newspaper or the envelope of a letter was disorienting. The familiar rigidity of Japanese military life clashed with the unexpected openness of their captors. Some sat in stunned silence, unsure how to react. Others whispered with one another, sharing fragments of information, astonished at the details of American daily life, the progress of the war, and the cultural differences revealed in the photographs and articles. The scenes set by these early exchanges would form the foundation for the prisoners' eventual emotional turning point. The simple act of being allowed to read, write, and connect with the world beyond the camp fences created a tension of disbelief and hope, a tension that would define the human experience within these remote Pacific camps for the remainder of the war. As weeks passed in the Pacific camps, the arrival of letters and newspapers became a quiet but transformative event. The U.S. military carefully coordinated these distributions. Letters sent from Japanese families were censored only to ensure security, but the Americans allowed prisoners to read them freely, an act that challenged every expectation ingrained by the Japanese military. Newspapers carried news from home, updates on the Pacific theater, and glimpses of daily life in cities far removed from war. Some editions even included photographs of ordinary American citizens, farmers, factory workers, and children, living lives of stability and relative comfort. For the prisoners, this was a revelation. Many Japanese POWs had endured propaganda that painted Americans as ruthless and relentless. To see their captors offering such access to information without intimidation or punishment created a profound cognitive dissonance. Officers and enlisted men alike struggled to reconcile their preconceptions with the tangible kindness and procedural fairness of the camp. Some were initially suspicious, fearing traps or hidden motives. Others, overwhelmed by emotion, wept quietly as they read words from home for the first time in months. The simplest messages, "I hope you are safe," or "We miss you," were enough to break through layers of fear and isolation, reminding prisoners of their humanity beyond the uniform. The Americans recognized the psychological power of information. Officers observed that prisoners who received regular correspondence displayed fewer disciplinary issues and greater willingness to participate in camp routines. Even the most rigid Japanese officers gradually softened their posture, astonished at the dignity extended to men they had been taught to expect cruelty from. Meanwhile, newspapers became a medium for cultural exposure. Articles on American industry, technological innovation, and social life revealed a society operating on principles radically different from Japan's wartime ethos. Hollywood stars, baseball games, and musical performances presented an alternative world, a world in which prisoners could momentarily escape the confines of their barracks and imagine life beyond war. The camp's atmosphere subtly shifted. Morning roll calls now included quiet anticipation. Evening lights dimmed with a murmured exchange of letters. Prisoners shared news with one another, comparing handwriting, marveling at photographs, and discussing reports of the war's progress. These conversations, though subdued, were charged with astonishment. For many, reading and receiving letters became a lifeline, a bridge to a reality they had feared was lost forever. Medical officers noted a surprising change in morale. Anxiety, insomnia, and depressive symptoms, common among POWs, began to ease. Small gatherings around letters and newspapers brought a sense of community previously absent. Even minor disagreements between prisoners diminished, replaced by curiosity and mutual support. The American strategic generosity had yielded more than compliance. It had cultivated dignity, resilience, and trust in an environment built on captivity. By late 1944, this system of humane engagement was firmly established across multiple Pacific camps. Word spread between camps, carried by returning prisoners or letters exchanged under supervision. Japanese soldiers began to anticipate the arrival of news from home, and American officers noted that the prisoners' reactions were consistently profound. Silence, awe, and tentative smiles punctuated each delivery, a quiet acknowledgement that the boundaries of wartime expectation had been irrevocably expanded. It was within this delicate tension, between disbelief and gratitude, between suspicion and hope, that the prisoner's perspective began to shift. What had begun as cautious curiosity would soon reach a pivotal emotional crescendo. When the first camp-wide distribution of letters and newspapers occurred, the prisoners would confront a revelation that neither the cruelty of war nor the rigidity of their upbringing could have prepared them for. The Americans, their captors, were demonstrating humanity in its most unexpected form. The human dimension of the letters and newspapers was immediate and profound. For prisoners, these items were far more than paper. They were a lifeline to family, to a world beyond the barbed wire, to a sense of identity that war had threatened to erase. Some prisoners sat on the wooden floors of the barracks, envelopes trembling in their hands, eyes wide and silent. Tears streaked dirt-smudged faces as they read words from mothers, wives, and siblings. A single line, "We are safe, and we await your return," could dissolve months of accumulated tension. Others whispered to their neighbors, sharing fragments of news and photographs, their voices low but charged with astonishment. The reactions were as varied as the prisoners themselves. Some stoic officers stared in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the generous treatment with their expectations of captivity. Young soldiers laughed quietly, almost incredulously, at images of American cities, children, or Hollywood actors they had only heard about in rumors. American officers recognized the emotional power of these small gestures. For them, the decision to distribute letters and newspapers was both moral and strategic. By allowing prisoners to reconnect with home, they fostered compliance without coercion. The psychological effect was measurable. Disciplinary incidents decreased, cooperation increased, and prisoners exhibited fewer signs of despair or aggression. Officers noted that prisoners who had once resisted orders began participating willingly in camp routines, from labor details to educational programs. The human angle revealed a paradox of war. In granting prisoners dignity and information, the Americans were simultaneously reinforcing the structure and order of captivity. Psychologically, the impact of the correspondence was layered. Letters reminded prisoners that they were still part of a larger world, that life persisted beyond the camp. Newspapers provided context for the broader conflict, reports of battles, Allied advances, and social news that contrasted sharply with the narrow, propagandized view many had held. For some, the gap between expectation and reality was staggering. The prisoners had been trained to believe that Americans were ruthless and indifferent, yet here they were, distributing information freely, allowing reading, discussion, and reflection. This dissonance forced prisoners to reassess assumptions about their captors, challenging both fear and ingrained ideology. The emotional weight was compounded by the knowledge that these moments of human connection were temporary and precious, adding a sense of fragility to each encounter with the letters and newspapers. Leadership within the camps played a crucial role in shaping responses. Senior Japanese officers initially struggled with the Americans' approach, torn between ingrained notions of honor, obedience, and the unprecedented opportunity to communicate with home. Many were hesitant to encourage subordinates to read the materials, fearing perceived weakness or loss of discipline. Yet over time, the officers observed the calm and order fostered by these interactions. The Americans had carefully structured distributions, small groups, supervised sessions, and consistent routines that prevented chaos. By demonstrating trust and fairness, the American leaders subtly guided Japanese officers toward acceptance, illustrating that humane treatment could coexist with the authority of captivity. The contrast between expectation and practice highlighted a deeper lesson in leadership. Respect and dignity could achieve outcomes that intimidation and coercion never could. Cultural shock was also a dominant theme. Prisoners were exposed to aspects of American life, family photographs, news about daily routines, images of entertainment that were entirely foreign to their experience. Hollywood stars, bustling cities, baseball games, and concerts represented a society. By the time the first large distribution was complete, the prisoners' reactions had shifted from individual astonishment to collective realization. The human dimension was no longer just private. It shaped the rhythm of camp life. Every interaction with letters and newspapers carried potential for emotional revelation, bridging divides between captors and captives. The psychological and leadership angles intertwined, demonstrating that small acts of respect and trust could ripple through an entire camp, altering behaviors, expectations, and morale. For the prisoners, these documents were evidence of an unexpected truth. Even in war, humanity could be extended without compromise, producing reactions of shock, disbelief, and ultimately, tentative hope. Beyond the immediate human and psychological reactions, the cultural angle revealed a profound clash of perspectives. Japanese prisoners were confronted with aspects of American life entirely alien to their wartime experience. Newspapers detailed urban life, technological innovation, and societal routines that seemed almost fantastical after months of isolation. Photographs of families, schools, and even entertainment, Hollywood stars, sporting events, orchestras, exposed the prisoners to a world operating on freedom, leisure, and creativity. For many, the juxtaposition was staggering. The rigid expectations of Japanese military culture, in which surrender was shameful and civilian life tightly controlled, collided with these glimpses of openness. Prisoners whispered among themselves, sometimes laughing quietly, sometimes shaking their heads in disbelief. They had expected harsh captivity and stern punishment, yet here were their captors allowing them access to information and images freely, encouraging engagement rather than suppressing curiosity. This cultural exposure did more than surprise. It subtly reshaped the prisoners' understanding of the war and their place within it. Seeing American women participating in work and leadership, civilians contributing to the war effort, and families living under relative security offered a contrast to the propaganda they had internalized. Some prisoners expressed astonishment at the concept of leisure and comfort existing alongside wartime production. Others marveled at the meticulous organization of American cities, their technological sophistication, and the apparent optimism captured in photographs and articles. These observations challenged deeply ingrained beliefs about the enemy, producing a mixture of awe and reluctant admiration. From a military perspective, the provision of letters and newspapers was not mere benevolence. It was a calculated strategy. American officers understood that morale influenced compliance, discipline, and cooperation. The prisoners' reactions were monitored carefully, with officers noting improvements in behavior and attitude following distributions. Japanese POWs who had been withdrawn, resentful, or resistant began participating more willingly in daily routines. Labor assignments, educational programs, and communal activities saw higher engagement. The act of reading news and letters provided structure to otherwise monotonous days, giving prisoners goals, conversation topics, and a sense of connection to the outside world. In this way, information became both a tool of psychological stabilization and a subtle demonstration of U.S. organizational and ethical superiority. The moral angle was equally compelling. The stark contrast between Japanese military doctrine and American treatment highlighted fundamental differences in wartime ethics. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated to expect cruelty, strict hierarchy, and punishment for failure, yet their captors demonstrated patience, fairness, and respect for individual dignity. Observers noted moments of quiet reflection among prisoners, some hesitating before opening letters, aware that their emotions were being invited rather than suppressed. Others expressed gratitude in subtle ways, small acts of cooperation, careful handling of materials, and gestures of politeness. For the Americans, these interactions were not only ethically sound but strategically effective, reinforcing order while honoring the humanity of those in their charge. Additionally, the exposure to news and culture created a feedback loop that extended beyond the individual prisoner. Conversations spread quickly. What one group had learned from a newspaper or a letter would be shared with others, generating discussion and debate. Prisoners compared accounts of the war, analyzed American society, and gradually built a nuanced understanding of the world beyond the camp. This collective cognitive shift was subtle but significant. By providing controlled access to information, the Americans were indirectly fostering critical thinking, cultural awareness, and emotional resilience. The prisoners' astonishment evolved into recognition. The Allies' superiority was not only in firepower or logistics, but in the capacity to combine discipline, ethics, and psychological insight. These cultural, military, and moral perspectives intertwined to create a layered understanding of captivity. The prisoners' initial shock gave way to curiosity, then comprehension, and finally a tentative respect for the principles guiding their captors. By engaging with letters and newspapers, Japanese POWs experienced the rare opportunity to see themselves through an alternate lens, a lens shaped by kindness, transparency, and structured freedom. This exposure challenged assumptions, altered behavior, and laid the groundwork for the climactic emotional moment when the camp collectively grasped the depth of their captors' generosity. Ultimately, Section 2 of the Angles demonstrates that the distribution of letters and newspapers was far more than a simple act of communication. It was a multifaceted intervention, cultural, tactical, and ethical, designed to maintain order, enhance compliance, and reveal the human side of the Allied forces. The prisoners' astonishment, laughter, and silent contemplation were testimony to a rare wartime phenomenon. Enemy combatants experiencing a moment of unanticipated humanity, simultaneously shocked and enlightened. This moment, combining disbelief with admiration, sets the stage for the emotional climax that will define the prisoners' experience for the remainder of their captivity. The morning of the first major distribution arrived with an unusual stillness. August sunlight filtered through the sparse clouds, casting long shadows over the camp's wooden barracks and barbed wire. Prisoners gathered in small groups, murmuring softly, eyes flicking between the approaching American guards and the bundles of letters and newspapers they carried. The air was thick with humidity, sweat already darkening the prisoners' uniforms. The routine of labor and roll calls had been interrupted, replaced by a charged anticipation that rippled through the camp. American officers moved deliberately, placing parcels on benches and tables arranged in orderly lines. Guards remained vigilant yet unobtrusive, observing without interference. For the prisoners, this calm, methodical approach was disorienting. There was no shouting, no threat, no expectation of forced behavior. The envelopes and newspapers were simply laid before them, each one an invitation to touch a world they had imagined only in fragments, and American officers walked among the prisoners, noting reactions, offering gentle guidance when someone hesitated, but otherwise allowing the moment to unfold organically. They understood the emotional significance. In allowing prisoners to read freely, they were extending a form of autonomy rarely experienced by enemy soldiers. The deliberate patience of the guards amplified the effect. Each gesture, each silent allowance, reinforced the stark contrast between expectation and reality. One officer recalled observing a Japanese captain who had refused all prior camp activities. He approached the distribution table, hesitant, and finally accepted a newspaper. His hands trembled as he opened it. The captain's eyes moved quickly across the pages. Articles on urban life, images of American families, updates on the progress of the war. For the first time, he seemed human, stripped of the rigid discipline and suspicion imposed by months of captivity. Other prisoners noticed, and a ripple of shared astonishment passed through the crowd. Laughter and whispered commentary began to punctuate the silence. This moment extended beyond individual reactions. The camp itself seemed to shift. Barracks, previously silent and tense, filled with murmured conversations about family, culture, and the war's progress. Prisoners compared letters, exchanged descriptions of photographs, and discussed the stark differences between expectation and reality. What had begun as hesitation and incredulity evolved into communal astonishment, the emotional energy building with every unfolding letter and newspaper. By mid-morning, the initial shock had coalesced into a tentative acceptance. The prisoners were speechless not from fear or coercion, but from awe and disbelief. The human, psychological, and cultural dimensions of the Americans' approach became evident. These letters and newspapers were not mere tools of communication. They were instruments of revelation, exposing prisoners to empathy, dignity, and the breadth of a world they had imagined as hostile and unattainable. In this first encounter, the prisoners' perception of captivity was irrevocably altered. Shock, disbelief, and tentative joy interwove in a complex emotional tapestry. The simple act of reading letters and newspapers had become a defining moment, the fulcrum upon which the prisoners' experience of war, captivity, and humanity would pivot. The stage was set for the full camp-wide realization, the crescendo of emotion that would mark the climax of their journey. By late morning, the distribution had expanded across the entire camp. Every barack, every small gathering of prisoners held the same quiet intensity. The Americans moved from group to group, delivering bundles with methodical care, their presence calm and reassuring. For the Japanese prisoners, what had begun as personal astonishment now became a collective experience. The camp seemed to breathe differently, the tension of confinement giving way to a shared sense of wonder and disbelief. Conversations arose in hushed tones. A young soldier held a letter from his sister, describing the care of his aging parents. Another unfolded a newspaper, pointing to a photograph of children playing in a park, their laughter captured in a single frozen moment. For many, these images were almost incomprehensible. Life could be ordinary, joyous, and secure, while the war raged on distant islands. Some prisoners laughed quietly, a sound foreign to the camp, while others remained silent, eyes fixed on the pages, absorbing details that challenged their understanding of the world. The psychological weight of these revelations was visible in small gestures. Prisoners shared letters with officers who had once been rigid and unyielding. Senior captains whispered commentary on articles, their voices softened by genuine curiosity rather than command. Soldiers who had withdrawn into themselves now spoke in measured tones, comparing images of American cities, commenting on cultural practices, or reading passages aloud to peers. The letters and newspapers became a bridge, connecting isolated individuals into a fragile, tentative community built on shared astonishment and human connection. American officers watched quietly, understanding the significance of these moments. They had anticipated curiosity, perhaps hesitation, but the depth of the prisoners' reactions exceeded expectation. Some soldiers wept silently. Others stared in awe at photographs of landscapes, schools, or theaters. The camp, once governed solely by routine and discipline, had become a space for reflection and recognition of humanity. The impact was immediate. Order and cooperation improved, not through fear, but through trust and exposure. The Americans had created a scenario in which respect and empathy became instruments of psychological strategy, producing compliance and morale simultaneously. The cultural contrast deepened the effect. Prisoners marveled at depictions of American life, from everyday labor in factories to celebrations in parks and concert halls. Hollywood stars, previously mythologized from afar, now appeared in photographs and articles, eliciting astonishment. Women were shown in leadership roles, children playing freely, families enjoying liberties that Japanese prisoners had scarcely imagined. Each page, each envelope, reinforced the notion that captivity did not preclude access to knowledge, choice, or comfort. The rigidity of military indoctrination collided with this reality, leaving prisoners speechless, laughter and tears coexisting in quiet corners of the camp. By mid-afternoon, The emotional crescendo reached its peak. A senior officer carefully held a letter detailing his family's survival after months of worry, eyes glistening. A young private unfolded a newspaper depicting a baseball game, and laughter rippled through his barracks. Soldiers shared observations and readings, pointing out differences in dress, architecture, and daily routines between America and Japan. For the first time, prisoners seemed to grasp the full implications of their captors' humanity. The shock was no longer merely individual. It had become collective, a shared realization of trust, care, and information unimpeded by fear. Observers noted subtle shifts in behavior. Prisoners moved with less tension. Conversations included tentative humor, and previously insular officers encouraged their subordinates to read, comment, and discuss. The simple act of providing letters and newspapers had transformed the camp's social and emotional landscape. The prisoners' astonishment was both personal and communal, a rare moment in war where human dignity and empathy penetrated the boundaries of captivity. This culmination of reaction, the mixture of speechless awe, quiet laughter, tentative smiles, and reflective silence, marked a turning point in the prisoners' experience. The camp, once defined solely by control and hierarchy, now became a space in which human connection and cultural exposure reshaped perceptions. Prisoners had confronted the unexpected reality that their captors were capable of generosity, care, and trust. In that moment, the barriers of fear and indoctrination began to crumble, leaving only the raw and honest impact of humane treatment. As the day ended and the last envelopes were read, the prisoners remained quiet, their minds heavy with astonishment. The letters and newspapers had delivered more than information. They had delivered a revelation that even in the midst of war, empathy, dignity, and respect could persist. This pivotal day would be remembered by those who lived through it as the moment when captivity became a testament to the human capacity for kindness, a turning point in the psychological and emotional experience of prisoners of war. In the weeks following the first major distribution of letters and newspapers, the camp settled into a transformed rhythm. The initial astonishment gave way to a sustained awareness among the prisoners that their captors were extending genuine care. Daily routines continued, roll calls, labor assignments, and inspections, but the atmosphere was subtly altered. Prisoners moved with less tension, and guards observed an unusual degree of cooperation. The emotional weight of the letters had not faded. Instead, it reinforced a quiet, enduring order rooted in mutual recognition of humanity. Medical officers noted significant improvements in morale and overall health. Instances of illness resulting from stress, malnutrition, or anxiety decreased. Soldiers who had previously resisted treatment now approached American medics willingly, no longer constrained by fear or rigid pride. Letters containing news from home alleviated psychological burdens, and newspapers offered cognitive engagement, providing distraction and intellectual stimulation. This combination reduced the incidence of depression, insomnia, and aggressive behavior, outcomes that reinforced the Americans' broader operational goals. Prisoner leadership evolved alongside these changes. Senior Japanese officers, once rigidly authoritarian, began facilitating discussions around newspapers and letters, recognizing the benefits of calm and engagement. Subordinate soldiers, seeing their officers participate, were encouraged to read and discuss without fear of reprimand. A subtle communal hierarchy emerged, defined less by strict military discipline and more by shared experiences, mutual curiosity, and the collective processing of information. Camp life became organized not solely by rules and punishment, but by voluntary participation in routines enriched by cultural and familial connection. Cultural understanding deepened as well. Prisoners shared what they learned, pointing to photographs, discussing articles, and comparing notes on letters received. They were exposed to American social norms, urban infrastructure, and even popular entertainment, from baseball games to musical performances. For many, this was the first sustained exposure to life outside the rigid confines of military expectation. It was both humbling and enlightening, a vivid reminder of the Allies' industrial strength, organizational sophistication, and societal resilience. The prisoners' astonishment at these details reinforced the perception of American dominance, not only in combat capability, but in the capacity to maintain order and humane treatment simultaneously. The Americans' strategic patience and ethical conduct proved to have long-term effects. Discipline in the camp became self-reinforcing. Prisoners complied with orders without coercion, engaged actively in labor and educational programs, and even assisted in maintaining camp facilities. Reports from officers highlighted that prisoners demonstrated a willingness to help fellow captives, a shift from initial hostility and suspicion. Small acts of generosity, such as sharing letters or guiding peers in reading newspapers, created a network of cooperation that reduced tensions and prevented unrest. Furthermore, the emotional impact of receiving news from home created lasting psychological bonds between prisoners and captors. Letters offered hope and reassurance, reminding soldiers that families remained intact, while newspapers provided context for the broader progress of the war. The prisoners' astonishment, once individual, had crystallized into a shared understanding of the Americans' operational and ethical superiority. The simple act of providing information had produced outcomes that weapons, drills, or punishments could never achieve: compliance, cooperation, trust, and a preservation of dignity. By the end of August 1944, the camp had become a microcosm of controlled but humane engagement. Prisoners, officers, and guards navigated a delicate balance. The authority of captors was unquestioned, yet the treatment extended to prisoners allowed for moments of reflection, communication, and personal agency. The Americans had demonstrated that dominance could coexist with empathy, that strict military order did not require cruelty, and that information, letters, and newspapers could be as transformative as any tactical maneuver on the battlefield. This transformation set the stage for the long-term consequences of humane treatment and psychological engagement. The prisoners' reactions, once tentative and private, had rippled through the camp, influencing behavior, morale, and perception of the war. The next stage would reveal how this human-centered approach shaped the broader dynamics of captivity, obedience, and cultural understanding, leaving an indelible mark on those who experienced it. And in the months following the initial distributions, the camp settled into a new equilibrium defined by a quiet, disciplined humanity. Letters and newspapers became routine, their arrival eagerly anticipated by prisoners who had once approached every interaction with suspicion. The psychological landscape of the camp had shifted profoundly. Fear and rigidity gave way to cautious curiosity, tentative trust, and a shared recognition of the Americans' methodical, humane approach. Even senior Japanese officers, who had initially resisted participation, now facilitated discussions, encouraging subordinates to read and engage. Cultural and psychological consequences were intertwined. Prisoners were exposed to American life in unprecedented detail. Photographs of women in leadership roles, civilians working in factories, and children playing freely contrasted sharply with the strict hierarchies and controlled environments of Japan. Soldiers marveled at technological achievements, city planning, and aspects of daily life previously unknown to them. This exposure reshaped their understanding of the broader world, illustrating the Allies' organizational sophistication and societal resilience. It also provided a powerful counterpoint to the indoctrination they had received. Americans were capable of both military effectiveness and ethical conduct. The distribution of information had broader moral implications. By offering letters and newspapers, the Americans demonstrated that respect and dignity were not incompatible with wartime authority. Prisoners recognized the deliberate patience and careful planning behind each act. The realization that their captors prioritized human welfare alongside operational security produced profound astonishment. Laughter, quiet conversation, and even tears became recurring elements of daily life, evidence of the prisoners' processing of new realities. These small, human moments revealed a larger truth. the Allies' dominance extended beyond weaponry and logistics to encompass ethical leadership and psychological insight. Historical records confirm the effectiveness of this approach. Reports from camp officers emphasized increased compliance, reduced illness, and improved morale. Prisoners were more willing to participate in labor and educational programs, assisted in maintaining camp facilities, and demonstrated respect for their captors' authority. Letters from home not only alleviated stress, but fostered community within the barracks, as soldiers shared news and photographs. The simple act of providing access to information had measurable, long-lasting effects. The prisoners' astonishment evolved into appreciation, and their behavior reflected both gratitude and renewed engagement with life inside the camp. The broader consequence was a redefinition of captivity itself. What had begun as a rigid, hierarchical environment now functioned as a space where trust, dignity, and human connection coexisted with military authority. Prisoners came to expect that their captors would uphold rules consistently, provide access to information, and treat them with a degree of respect previously unimaginable. This created a sustainable system in which the prisoners' morale and cooperation were maintained without coercion, a model of humane engagement that contrasted sharply with the harsh treatment many had endured elsewhere in the Pacific Theater. By late 1944, the camp had become a microcosm of disciplined humanity. Letters and newspapers were more than communication tools. They were instruments of psychological stabilization, cultural exposure, and ethical demonstration. The prisoners' reactions, astonishment, laughter, silent contemplation, and even tears, reflected the profound impact of this approach. The Americans had not only maintained order and discipline, but had also provided prisoners with a rare opportunity to reconnect with home, engage with culture, and experience the moral dimensions of leadership. This enduring transformation set the stage for reflection on the larger significance of humane treatment in wartime captivity and the lessons it provided for both prisoners and captors. The psychological, cultural, and moral consequences of these actions would reverberate long after the war, influencing behavior, attitudes, and understanding of human dignity in conflict and the quiet that followed. The camp's transformations lingered in memory long after the letters and newspapers were read. For the prisoners, the experience revealed a profound truth. Even in the harshest circumstances, humanity could persist. Astonishment had given way to understanding, disbelief to tentative trust. The simple act of providing information, letters from home, newspapers, photographs, had reshaped perceptions, softened suspicion, and allowed dignity to coexist with captivity. For the Americans, the outcomes confirmed a principle that extended beyond the camp gates. Military superiority was not measured solely by firepower, logistics, or strategic victories. It was also demonstrated in the capacity to wield compassion as a tool of order, engagement, and moral authority. By allowing prisoners access to knowledge and personal connection, the Allies achieved a balance of control and care, proving that discipline and empathy were not mutually exclusive. The prisoners' astonishment, laughter, and quiet reflection became a testament to the psychological dimensions of warfare. These moments illuminated the human side of conflict. That war affects not only territory and resources, but the hearts and minds of those involved. The cultural exposure, the ethical treatment, and the steady provision of information offered a rare opportunity for introspection, bridging gaps of fear and ideology. It was a reminder that in the midst of global conflict, acts of simple humanity could ripple across individuals, reshaping behavior and understanding in ways that no weapon could. In historical perspective, the letters and newspapers were more than objects. They were instruments of revelation, offering prisoners a glimpse of life beyond the barbed wire and the battlefield. They challenged assumptions, revealed the Allies' organizational and ethical strength, and left an enduring impression on those who received them. Ultimately, this episode underscores a quiet but enduring lesson of World War II. That power is most profound when tempered by respect, that dominance is most lasting when combined with humanity, and that even in captivity, the human spirit can respond to care, curiosity, and truth. The astonished faces of the prisoners, reading, whispering, and contemplating, remain an enduring symbol of the subtle but transformative impact of empathy in the theater of war. The full script now has completed. Hook, context, angles, climax, aftermath, and reflection, ready for formatting into a cinematic YouTube documentary that in the quiet that followed. The camp's transformations lingered in memory long after the letters and newspapers were read. For the prisoners, the experience revealed a profound truth. Even in the harshest circumstances, humanity could persist. Astonishment had given way to understanding, disbelief to tentative trust. The simple act of providing information, letters from home, newspapers, photographs, had reshaped perceptions, softened suspicion, and allowed dignity to coexist with captivity. For the Americans, the outcomes confirmed a principle that extended beyond the camp gates. Military superiority was not measured solely by firepower, logistics, or strategic victories. It was also demonstrated in the capacity to wield compassion as a tool of order, engagement, and moral authority. By allowing prisoners access to knowledge and personal connection, the Allies achieved a balance of control and care, proving that discipline and empathy were not mutually exclusive.